Anthony, I just want to ask you to read between the lines of an argument that seems to be developing between the Biden administration and Benjamin Netanyahu. The Biden administration has sanctioned more illegal Israeli settlers and an Israeli NGO, which is partially funded by the Israeli government. Benjamin Netanyahu has been very quick to respond. He's not happy at all with those sanctions being imposed. But surely if American sanctions are imposed on any group and an outside group interacts with that sanctioned one, then the outside group should also be sanctioned. So if Benjamin Netanyahu's government pays that NGO again, they're violating the American sanctions. What's the real story here? That neither side really cares?
The real story is basically that Biden and the EU and Australia, a number of countries, in fact, in the last 6-12 months have imposed a handful of sanctions on some radical right-wing settlers, and that should be welcomed. But the elephant in the room is being ignored here, which is the fact that the Israeli government is the one that is backing, arming, training, supporting these settlers. I mean, the settlers are in the heart of the government. Netanyahu worries that the sanctions will increase, that it will not just be 6 or 7 and a handful of NGOs, but in fact could be members of his own government who he relies on to stay in power. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but people often focus on them to the exclusion of many others in the Israeli government who, let's be clear, the vast majority of whom views are very similar. Not all, but very, very similar, who do believe in ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and Gaza. So Netanyahu worries that the sanctions will increase. And Biden, the last few months, from my understanding, has rejected thus far to sanction the Israeli government. He has the chance to do so. I mean, he's only got 3-4 months left in power. This is what needs to happen. And the EU chief just this week, in fact, called for that very action.
So many analysts, including we who report on it in the media, look to the West for a possible solution. But the implications for the wider region, how intense are those implications? And only one thing that I would consider would be Saudi Arabia imminently supposed to be signing the Abraham Accords to actually establish diplomatic relations with Israel. If Israel displaces hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians from their lands, the Saudis can't sign that, surely.
Well, can't sign, and I would argue don't really care. Let's also be frank about that. I mean, most Arab countries for years, their eyes are open about what is going on in Palestine. This is not exactly a secret. West Bank, Gaza for years, long before October 7, and even still, they were very happy to sign the Abraham Accords a few years ago. Look, Saudi has talked about some kind of need for a pathway towards a Palestinian state. Everybody knows, including Saudi, that's not going to happen. What the Saudis want is some kind of military deal with the US, more weapons, and probably even more spyware from Israel, with this fig leaf of some kind of possibility somewhere down the track of a two-state solution. And let's be clear, since October 7, you talk about so-called Western credibility. There is no Western credibility for years. I mean, ultimately, anyone who looks at so many global conflicts would regard the US's role as escalating troubles, not reducing them. And that's the sad reality. And I think many people, I'm talking about Arab people here, not Arab regimes, are very aware that the US is not an equal broker. It's Israel's lawyer, essentially. And I would argue that the negotiations of some kind of settlement in Gaza is a fig leaf to allow Israel to continue its criminality in Gaza and, frankly, in the West Bank. And again, it needs to be said repeatedly, without financial sanctions on Israel, on the government, on the stopping of arms sales, this kind of activity in the West Bank and Gaza will just continue.
So we're saying now it may well be, Anthony, a specific Israeli military tactic that phone and internet communications are down in those 4 West Bank cities that have been the main target of these assaults. So much has been talked about violations of international law. We know the International Court of Justice looking into an accusation that Israel is committing genocide, the International Criminal Court seeking arrest warrants for Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and Benjamin Netanyahu. At some stage, international law will have to make a decision about whether war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed. And Benjamin Netanyahu, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, any of those far-right leaders who are pushing all of these assaults, they will surely understand that they are going to be investigated. Do they think they're going to get away with it?
At this stage, yes, but of course, if the ICC arrest warrants come through, and I note this week the ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan has urged the judges to make a finding for those arrest warrants. If those arrest warrants come for certain Hamas leaders and Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, then the question is enforcement. Will nations enforce that arrest warrant if Netanyahu wants to go, for example, to vast parts of Europe or other countries? Will those nations arrest him and send him to The Hague? I mean, that is the ultimate question. Enforcement is the question. The ICC for years has frankly dragged its feet on this issue, as they have on virtually every kind of Western crime from Iraq to Afghanistan onwards. They have chosen deliberately not to cover these issues. They have the opportunity here to actually try to hold Israeli government ministers to account for what's happening in Gaza particularly, and obviously the West Bank. And ultimately then it's going to be enforcement. And enforcement is the key, because at the moment we have seen certain Western leaders, the majority of Western leaders really, still giving 110% support. There are exceptions, governments of Ireland, Belgium, and some others. But overall, the vast bulk of Western leaders who are not seeking credibility, they're seeking to essentially, I mean, they believe, I would argue, a degree of Israel's ethno-nationalist agenda. They support it. They believe in it. They're also arming Israel and receiving weapons themselves from Israel. So it's kind of a mutually agreeable situation.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Anthony Lowenstein speaking to us from Sydney.
Thank you.